Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a horror TV series named The Last of Us, Season 1, Episode 1 to 5. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The story begins in the summer of 2003 when a high school student, Sarah, finished her day of classes. Instead of heading straight home, she went to a watch repair shop. Today was her father's birthday, so she planned to fix his favorite watch as a birthday gift. Police cars whizzed by the shop, which Sarah had grown accustomed to, as there had been frequent incidents of violence lately. However, the shop owner seemed particularly nervous, preparing to close early. She felt that there were more police cars than usual today. Fortunately, her father's watch was already fixed, so Sarah was rushed out of the shop. Since her father hadn't finished work yet, she habitually went to visit her neighbors. She found their pet dog staring at the paralyzed elderly neighbor lady. Sarah didn't think much of it and just left the neighbor's house, only to see several fighter jets roaring overhead. She felt a bit uneasy, wondering if something was really happening today. It wasn't until after 10 p.m. that her father, Joel, returned home, exhausted. There was no birthday cake or well wishes from friends and family, but his daughter had fixed his watch as a birthday gift, which touched him. Father and daughter watched TV together until late at night. Suddenly, Joel's phone rang. It was his brother Tommy, who had beaten up a man suddenly going crazy and was now in police custody. After settling his sleeping daughter, Joel hurriedly left to bail his brother out. Not long after, Sarah was awakened by the roar of a helicopter. She went downstairs and turned on the TV, which was broadcasting an emergency from the authorities, urging citizens to stay home and not go outside. As Sarah was wondering what was going on, she suddenly noticed the neighbor's pet dog barking at the door. She intended to return it to the neighbor's house, but just as she reached the door, the pet dog ran away in fear. Seeing the open door of the neighbor's house, Sarah curiously went inside, only to discover a pool of sticky blood and the gasping elderly neighbor nearby. The frightened girl didn't know what to do when she heard a faint sound in the hallway. It was the paralyzed neighbor lady licking the blood and with her mouth full of a fluffy substance. Terrified, Sarah backed away and ran towards the outside of the house. At the door, she happened to run into her father, who had just returned. Unexpectedly, the elderly lady chased after them. Without hesitation, Joel knocked her down with an axe. The little girl was scared, but her father had realized the situation on his way back. So he put his daughter in the pickup truck and urged his brother to drive away. By now, there were infected individuals on the streets, and police cars could be seen whizzing everywhere. A previous radio broadcast mentioned a possible fungal infection, causing people to fall into a frenzied state. Joel decided to flee the area first. People were constantly calling for help on the highway, but Joel didn't let Tommy stop the car, even if it was for a child. However, as they were about to leave the city, they encountered a massive traffic jam. Tommy had no choice but to take a detour through the wasteland. But the road ahead was also blocked by the military. After going around in circles, the group ended up in a small town, only to find the situation even worse there. The streets were full of frenzied infected individuals and fleeing crowds, like this was the end of the world. Suddenly, a plane plummeted from the sky, crashing by the roadside and causing a massive explosion. When Joel woke up, he found that his daughter's leg was injured. He struggled to help her to the road, but an out-of-control police car came crashing towards them. Tommy, trapped against the wall, was blocked by the ensuing fire. The situation was too chaotic, so he told his brother to leave without him, and they would meet later by the river. So Joel hurriedly carried his daughter towards the suburbs. There were infected people everywhere, eating human flesh, and the situation was even worse than before. Father and daughter were soon targeted by an infected individual, and Joel had to run into the nearest restaurant. However, the infected person was incredibly fast and chased them relentlessly. Joel escaped from the back door of the restaurant, and just as they were about to be caught, a gunshot rang out. The infected person fell to the ground, and it turned out that a patrolling soldier happened to pass by. However, when the soldier saw the injured Sarah, he became nervous. After consulting with his superiors through his walkie-talkie, he raised his gun and fired at them. Joel instinctively rolled away with his daughter to avoid the shots, but the soldier tried to come closer for another shot. Suddenly, someone from behind shot the soldier down. It was Tommy, who had arrived just in time. Joel checked his wound, which was just grazed by a bullet, but his daughter was not so lucky. A large amount of blood flowed from her abdomen, and she was breathing heavily. Joel cried out for them to go to the hospital immediately, but Tommy just stood there with a tear-streaked face because Sarah had already stopped breathing. Fast forward 20 years, and humanity still hadn't found a cure or vaccine. The unknown fungus wreaked havoc on Earth, and the world was now a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The authorities could only establish quarantine zones in areas with a high concentration of survivors, occasionally accepting people from the wilderness as long as they tested negative for infection. However, life inside the quarantine zones had changed dramatically. Strict laws were enforced, such as not disturbing the order and not entering or leaving the quarantine zones without permission. Anyone caught violating these rules would be sentenced to death. Ordinary survivors had to rely on their labor to exchange for credits. Joel, working as a body carrier, could only earn enough credits for 3 meals a day. Fortunately, he had his own sources to obtain some sedative pills, which he sold to sleep-deprived soldiers for extra income. Now, his biggest concern was his brother Tommy, who had been out on a mission for 3 whole weeks without any news. The watchtower supervisor, who owed Joel a favor, told him that the last message Tommy sent was relayed through the Costa Tower. In this harsh, post-apocalyptic world, Joel continued to struggle for survival, always concerned for his brother's safety. However, hope still lingered in the hearts of the survivors, who clung to the belief that one day, a cure or vaccine would be found, and humanity would rise again. In the meantime, Joel and the others had to adapt and endure in the face of the fungal infection that had devastated the Earth. Joel immediately went home to find the exact location of the Costa Tower. He was sure that if anything had happened to his brother, it would be nearby. The world was now a chaotic place, with not only bloodthirsty infected, but also rampant robbers and bandits. Even within the quarantine zones, there were numerous rebel groups, with the Fireflies being the most powerful. However, Joel's top priority now was to search for his brother. The next morning, Joel's partner, Tess, brought him some bad news. The car battery they had purchased had been stolen. With human technology having severely regressed, gasoline and batteries had become scarce resources. Without a car, they couldn't go out and search for his brother, so they had to try and steal the battery back. After spending some money in the market, they finally learned the whereabouts of the thieves' hideout. When they arrived at the location through the sewers, Tess suddenly screamed as she discovered an infected corpse on the wall. They searched every corner of the place and eventually found a hidden passage, which was blocked by an iron door. Joel noticed blood seeping through the door's crevices and realized something was wrong. Pushing the door open, they found a corridor filled with dead bodies, including the thieves who had taken the battery. Using a flashlight, Joel discovered that the battery had been damaged. They then heard some movement in the depths of the corridor. 2 people were slowly making their way forward, supporting each other. A figure suddenly rushed out with a knife, and to Joel's surprise, it was a young teenager. The 2 people turned around, and both sides breathed a sigh of relief. They had dealt with each other before. The pair were none other than the leader of the Fireflies rebel group, Marlene, and her companion. The thieves had stolen the battery and tried to trade with Marlene, but they ended up being killed instead. Marlene was severely injured, and knowing that Joel was a former soldier, she proposed a deal. Joel and Tess would escort a young girl to Firefly's base in the Massachusetts State House in exchange for weapons and car batteries. Joel and Tess agreed that it was worth it. The destination wasn't far, and only by obtaining the rewards could they venture further to search for Joel's brother. Before leaving, Marlene pleaded with Joel, almost begging him to ensure the girl reached her destination safely, as she was of great importance to all of humanity. Thus, the young girl, Ellie, went with Joel back to his home. Joel was curious about her identity, but Ellie was very clever and cautious, refusing to reveal any information about herself, even when she almost attacked Joel. As night fell, a curfew was enforced throughout the quarantine zone. Joel, Tess, and Ellie used the sewers to make their way outside the zone. The couple was clearly experienced in such matters, easily avoiding the patrolling soldiers. However, while passing through a house, they were spotted by a soldier who had stepped outside for a moment. Joel didn't dare to resist and obediently surrendered. As the soldier was about to check Ellie's identity and infection status, she suddenly fought back. This act enraged the soldier. Joel recalled a similar scene from 20 years ago and charged at the soldier, knocking him down with a series of punches until he no longer responded. At that moment, Tess raised the detector and shouted that Ellie is infected. But the girl desperately explained that her wound was already 3 weeks old and she hadn't turned yet. Joel couldn't focus on this issue, as more soldiers would arrive soon. They needed to leave immediately. Despite his concerns, he takes Ellie away from the quarantine zone and brings her to a safe house in the wilderness before confronting her about her wound. Ellie rolls up her sleeve, revealing that although she was bitten, the wound has not become infected. Initially, Marlene, the rebel leader of the Fireflies, had similar concerns and had kept Ellie locked in a room for nearly 3 weeks, testing her health daily. Joel believes Ellie will eventually mutate and suggests giving up the mission and taking her back to the quarantine zone. As he's eating some dried meat, Ellie takes out a delicious sandwich from her backpack, which Marlene had prepared for her. Seeing this, Tess is intrigued and asks why Marlene values Ellie so much, as a sandwich is considered a luxury item in the quarantine zone. Ellie finally reveals the purpose of the trip. It turns out that after days of testing, Marlene has determined that Ellie is immune to the infection. Coincidentally, there's an expert working on a cure in the Fireflies' base. That's why Marlene entrusted Joel with taking Ellie there, as she might be the key to finding a vaccine. With Ellie being so important to the Fireflies, the reward for the escort mission seems guaranteed. The trio finally agrees to continue their journey to the Fireflies' base. This is the first time Ellie sees the full view of the wilderness. Despite the ruined skyscrapers, their former splendor is still evident. Joel says the base is just across the street. Though a direct route would be faster, it's filled with the infected, so they opt to take a detour for safety. Ellie is wondering why they haven't encountered any infected yet. Tess realizes that Ellie has never been to the wilderness and asks how she got bitten. Ellie reveals it happened in a sealed mall within the quarantine zone, a place Tess knows is off-limits according to the authorities. Tess glances at Joel, as if to say Ellie isn't the obedient little girl she seems to be. Suddenly, they all stop as they hear faint growling noises in the distance. Tess scans the area and urges them to move faster. The group quickly arrives at an abandoned building, which they must pass through to reach the other side of the street. Fortunately, the water isn't too deep. Ellie looks around in amazement as a human skeleton suddenly surfaces. Joel hurries to ensure there's no danger before allowing everyone to continue on their way. They then reach a blocked passageway, with Tess leading the way inside. The space between the debris is large, allowing them to easily pass through obstacles and eventually arrive at the top-floor sky bridge. However, they get panicked as the street ahead is filled with vicious, bloodthirsty infected who can easily detect movements within a far distance, making it impossible to sneak around quietly. Left with no choice, Joel and the others change direction and opt for the safer church area. The walls here are covered with withered fungus, which could potentially hide the infected. Not taking any chances, they all take out their weapons. The church's main entrance is open, and Joel cautiously enters first. Wherever the light sweeps, there are withered infected and fungus. Suddenly, a corpse appears in front of them. Joel guesses the person must have encountered the infected outside and sought refuge inside the church. Ellie, however, senses that something is off and wonders how the man died. Joel urgently warns Ellie to stay quiet, not to make a sound. They carefully ascend the stairs. As they go higher, there appears to be more withered fungus and corpses, giving them the feeling of being in a chaotic graveyard. Ellie accidentally steps on a withered arm, the resulting crackling sound causing everyone to panic. They look around, relieved that it didn't attract any infected. Just then, the wall near the door suddenly collapses, and the falling debris blocks their path. Everyone holds their breath, not daring to make a sound. A hunched figure then enters, and Joel signals for everyone to hide behind a cabinet. This type of infected is sensitive to sound, so they must not make any noise. The entire hall echoes with the strange growls of the infected. Joel hastily raises his gun and fires, but another infected charges out of the darkness. The three of them quickly become separated in the chaos, each hiding on their own. Joel carefully avoids the infected and finally spots Ellie. Just as they are about to leave, Joel accidentally steps on broken glass on the ground, attracting the infected. Joel quickly shoots and kills one of them, but another one soon appears. Tess promptly steps in, using an axe to impair its hearing, while Joel shoots and eliminates the infected. Unfortunately, Ellie is bitten again, but she seems unfazed, clearly confident in her immunity. Tess, however, has sprained her ankle during the fight. She catches up with Joel and Ellie, who are admiring the scenery, and urges them to hurry. After passing through the church area and crossing the street, they'll finally reach their destination. Ellie is curious about the deep pit in front of them, and Tess stops to explain that it was caused during the initial outbreak of the fungus. The scene shifts to a city back in the summer of 2003. A well-known professor in mycology is having breakfast when several soldiers suddenly arrive at the restaurant and take her to its secret laboratory. The officer in charge wastes no time, showing her a sample under a microscope. The professor quickly identifies it as a cordyceps fungus and becomes serious when told it was extracted from a human body. She knows that cordyceps cannot survive inside humans. Without explanation, the officer takes her to an isolation room where a corpse lies. The professor briefly examines the body and notices bite marks on its ankle. Cutting it open, she finds the area filled with fungus. She then uses forceps to probe inside its mouth, pulling out wriggling strands of the cordyceps fungus. Terrified, the professor rushes out of the lab. The officer hands her a glass of water and reassures her to stay calm. He explains that the corpse was found a few days ago in a flower factory, where witnesses saw a worker suddenly go berserk, biting and killing several colleagues. The professor starts to tremble, realizing the fungus has spread. Because it had never been found inside humans before, there are no antidotes or vaccines. The only way to stop it from spreading is to completely destroy the city. Learning of the outbreak, Ellie stares at the missile crater in front of her. Having grown up in a quarantine zone, she cannot imagine the pain and hardships that humanity endured during the initial stages of the fungal outbreak. The rest of the journey went smoothly, and Joel's group finally arrived at the Firefly's base. Not daring to barge in recklessly, they first inspected a truck parked outside. The bloodstains on the seats gave Joel a bad feeling, and he soon discovered a human corpse under the truck's wheels. Tess hurriedly dragged Ellie into the hall. To their horror, they found numerous dead bodies on the floor. The Firefly's rebel forces had been wiped out. Joel noticed one of the infected among them, which could be the cause of their demise. Tess, however, got angry, unwilling to accept that their escort mission had failed. Ellie suddenly mentioned that Tess was infected, and sure enough, she had been bitten by an infected back in the church. The fungus was spreading inside her, while Ellie's bite wound had almost healed, indicating the presence of antibodies within her body. Tess became agitated and urged Joel to take Ellie to their expert friends, as she might be the only hope for developing a vaccine. At that moment, an infected on the ground suddenly stirred. Joel rushed over and shot it, but the fungus inside the body was still slowly wriggling. The infected nearby seemed to sense something and stood up, roaring loudly. Joel sensed danger and ran out to check, only to find a horde of infected charging towards them. Tess pushed over gasoline barrels inside the hall, scattering weapons and ammunition all over the floor. She told Joel to take Ellie and go, while she stayed behind to cover their escape. Though Joel was reluctant, he dragged Ellie towards the back door. As the growling of the infected drew closer, Tess hastily pulled out her lighter. Unfortunately, the infected had already rushed in, and she couldn't light the fire due to her infection, which temporarily prevented them from attacking her. She finally managed to light the fire in the nick of time. Outside the building, Joel and Ellie watched the raging flames, with eyes filled with grief and loss. They had lost a companion like this before, reflecting the cruelty of the post-apocalyptic wasteland. Since her death, Joel has been silent, as he had always thought Tess would be a woman he'd spend the end of the world with. Ellie believed that everyone has their own choices to make, and that Joel should complete the task Tess hadn't been able to finish. These words seemed to awaken Joel, who urged Ellie to leave quickly. They needed to seek help from their expert friend Bill, outside the quarantine zone. On their way, the duo passed through a farm, where Joel had stashed supplies before. However, it had been a long time since he'd last visited, so he needed to search for the supplies. Ellie was intrigued by everything she saw, because she had never left the quarantine zone. She discovered a storage room and excitedly jumped in, but unfortunately, the shelves were empty, with the only item left being a box of sanitary napkins. Suddenly, a growling sound came from a corner, and upon shining a light, they found an infected trapped under a pile of stones. Ellie nervously approached and found that the infected wasn't as terrifying as she had imagined, so she calmly stabbed the infected in the face. In the meantime, Bill had already gathered supplies and was considering whether to take a long gun with him, but ultimately decided against it due to its scarce ammunition. The pair continued their journey, with Ellie expressing her admiration for the airplane wreckage along the way and envying those who had experienced flight. Joel bluntly told her that they were all dead, which only piqued Ellie's curiosity even more. She wanted to know how the first infected appeared before the apocalypse. Joel speculated that it could be due to a mutated fungus that entered the human food chain through wheat. On the night of September 26, 2003, many people fell ill and began biting others. As they talked, they arrived at a pit filled with countless human corpses. Ellie's eyes were filled with shock and confusion, but Joel seemed unfazed. He explained that when the fungus began to spread on a large scale, the military forced all residents to go to quarantine zones, which quickly filled up. As a result, these residents were executed and dumped into the pit, because the military believed that it was better for ordinary people to die than to be infected. However, Bill, the bearded man, did not go to the quarantine zone like the other residents. He was an extreme survivalist who had stockpiled massive amounts of supplies in his home before the fungal outbreak. He believed that one could only rely on themselves to survive the apocalypse. When Bill was the last person left in the town, he began building defensive structures, storing up supplies like gasoline and fuel, poultry and vegetables. Barbed wire and wooden planks were used to block the main roads leading to the town. Besides that, some small traps were also set up around the perimeter. Bill lived a peaceful life for 4 years until one day, someone fell into a trap outside the quarantine fence. Curious, Bill went out to investigate and found that the intruder was also a bearded man named Frank, who had escaped the quarantine zone with some companions and became the only survivor when they arrived here. Unable to bear Frank's desperate pleas, Bill checked that he was not infected and agreed to provide him with a meal. Bill sat in silence, just wanting Frank to leave. However, when Frank saw the piano in the living room, he couldn't help but become excited and insisted on playing a song before leaving. As the out-of-tune music began, Bill felt his ears were being tortured and interrupted Frank's performance. He wanted Frank to know what real piano music sounded like. The beautiful melody started again, accompanied by Bill's deep voice. Frank listened, utterly mesmerized, feeling the loneliness that Bill poured into his singing and strongly resonated with it. So Bill hesitantly accepted the man into his secluded life. The two lived together for another 3 years, and their differences gradually emerged. Bill was a typical homebody, while Frank couldn't stand loneliness and would rather clean up the shops on the street than stay at home. During this time, they met Tess and Joel in the quarantine zone through the radio. At first, Bill was not friendly towards them, but Joel immediately helped Bill with a big problem once he started talking. The wire fences and other defensive measures had started to rust and deteriorate. He could bring some new supplies from the quarantine zone to exchange with Bill, allowing the two to taste some long-lost delicacies. From then on, their relationship became closer. One day, Joel suddenly warned Bill that the wire fence could keep out the infected, but not ill-intentioned humans. Little did they know that these words would soon become reality. That night, a group of heavily armed robbers arrived at the edge of the small town. Fortunately, the defensive traps were activated in time. The raging fire soon woke up the sleeping Frank. He searched the room but couldn't find Bill, who had already gone outside to confront the enemies. Frank shouted for Bill to come back, only for a bullet to hit him the next moment. Frank quickly helped Bill back into the house. His abdomen was bleeding, and he felt like he couldn't hold on much longer. He urged Frank to leave and find Joel. Frank didn't respond, just tightly holding Bill's cold and weak hands. 10 years later, it turns out that Bill didn't die that night. Now, because of old age, Frank had developed a severe illness and couldn't take care of himself. Bill took on all responsibilities willingly. However, Frank didn't want to be a burden to Bill, so he decided to end his life that night. Although Bill was reluctant, he still supported his lover's decision. With tears in his eyes, Frank said that the wonderful days he had spent with Bill were more than with anyone else. So he pushed Frank in a wheelchair along the street of the small town. They admired the white flowers they had planted together and revisited the place where they first met. Then they picked out 2 perfectly fitting suits and exchanged rings under the witness of the setting sun. As night fell, Bill prepared another feast for Frank, just like the first time they dined together. Frank smiled, saying that today was the most wonderful day of his life. Bill couldn't bear to look at him and quietly mixed the powdered medicine into their wine glasses. Frank then drank the entire glass of red wine. Bill said that he had already put the medicine into both of their glasses, and he was content to die with his beloved. Afterward, they looked at each other and couldn't help but laugh. Under the dim light, Bill pushed Frank towards the bedroom. At this time, Joel and Ellie had arrived at Bill's town. After using the password to open the iron gate, Joel saw the withered flowers at Bill's front door, and a bad feeling came to him. Upon seeing the spoiled food on the dining table, he hurried to Bill's bedroom, only to find the door locked from the inside. Ellie saw the letter and the key on the table, which were Bill's last will. She told Joel not to go into the bedroom because the smell inside might be unbearable. In the will, Bill believed that Joel was the only one who understood him in protecting his loved one for a lifetime. So he left all the weapons and vehicles to Joel to continue protecting his loved ones. However, looking at the key left by Bill, Joel opened the warehouse door, revealing a well-preserved truck. As long as the battery was charged, it could be driven away. Joel once again confirmed that Ellie had not been infected and then shared his plan for the future. He was going to Wyoming to find his younger brother Tommy, a former member of Fireflies, who might be able to take Ellie to a nearby lab. The young girl naturally agreed. Joel reminded her to listen to him and never reveal her identity or the scar on her hand. Soon they went to the basement, where an entire wall was filled with weapons. Ellie couldn't help but admire Bill for being such a tough character. Moreover, the supplies here were fully stocked. Joel told Ellie to take as much as possible, but the girl went beyond expectations by secretly stuffing a handgun into her backpack. When everything was ready, they got into the charged car. Joel fastened the seatbelt for Ellie, who was riding in a car for the first time. Then, they drove on a new adventure towards Wyoming, where Joel's brother was. Due to the long journey, they must stop at every gas station they pass to collect gasoline. Although there are many abandoned cars on both sides of the road, they are too old, and the gasoline in the tanks has long evaporated. After a day and night's journey, Ellie's novelty had worn off. She found a cassette tape in the back seat, and soon an ancient melodious song played in the car. Ellie also found a men's magazine, which made Joel anxious, urging her to throw it away and not to look. She seemed much more mature than she appeared. Joel tried to take highways as much as possible, to avoid encountering obstacles or infected people. Only the broken buildings seemed to tell of the past misery and chaos. As night was about to fall, Joel drove the car off the highway and entered a dense forest. Although it was difficult to encounter infected people far away from the city, they dared not make a fire to cook and could only eat some canned food. Joel knew from his years of experience that sometimes living humans were much more terrifying than the infected. Just as they prepared to sleep on their makeshift beds, Ellie suddenly asked why the Scarecrow got an award. Joel thought for a moment and said it was because he was outstanding in the field. The unexpected joke eased Joel's mind, but he did not let down his guard. After a night's rest, Joel brewed a cup of bitter coffee, and then they continued on their way. Ellie checked the map and found that they were still a day and night's journey from their destination. She suddenly became very interested in Joel's brother, and the man didn't hide anything. He said his brother Tommy always dreamed of saving the world and joined the army right after high school. After the fungal outbreak, Joel joined Tommy's team to protect him, and they went to Boston together. There, Joel met Tess, and Tommy met Marlene, and subsequently joined the Fireflies. Joel always felt that his brother was naively dreaming of saving the world. Ellie suddenly asked aloud why everyone still lived if there was no hope. Joel said his hope was to protect his loved ones, so he went to find his brother. Ellie was moved by that and asked if she was considered his family. Joel replied that she could only be considered cargo, but he had promised his dead wife to protect Ellie. As the two were talking, more and more abandoned vehicles appear on both sides of the road. Joel had to stop the car because the road ahead was blocked by a truck. He carefully looked around, knowing that it was impossible to clear the obstacle. The only option was to take a detour, but this meant they would have to leave the highway and cross through a nearby human city, which was much more dangerous than the previous route. Traces of burning corpses were everywhere. Ellie suddenly saw an abandoned quarantine zone, and an injured person ran up to them for help. Without thinking, Joel told Ellie to fasten her seatbelt and then stepped on the gas, only to find that an ambush had been set up all around them. The car tires were punctured in an instant, and they crashed into a convenience store. Joel knew they had encountered a gang of robbers, which was quite common in the post-apocalyptic world. Bullets whizzed by, and Joel yelled as he quickly got up and fought back. Ellie took the opportunity to hide in the small hole in the wall opposite. When the gunfire outside finally ceased and all the enemies were eliminated, Joel was about to reload when someone burst in through the back door. Caught off guard, he was choked by the intruder. Ellie realized that Joel was about to give in, so she pulled out her hidden gun and shot the intruder in the leg without hesitation. The man begged for his shitty life and pulled out a dagger to show he had no intention of resisting. Joel ignored him, took Ellie's gun, and told her to hide back in the wall hole. The pleas for mercy outside stopped abruptly. Ellie knew that Joel had killed the intruder, but pretended nothing had happened. The young girl knew the rules of survival in the apocalypse. There was no room for mercy or compassion. Joel was somewhat surprised by her behavior, but said nothing. Their priority was to leave the area as soon as possible. As expected, the gunfight drew the attention of local armed forces. A large group of armed civilians gathered around several corpses, and someone concluded that outsiders must have done it. The new rebel leader of Fireflies, a woman named Catherine, was highly tense, thinking it was likely that these were reinforcements sent by her old rival, Henry. She then called together all her men, determined to capture the troublemakers. Catherine's excessive caution was not without reason, as she had recently led the lower-class citizens in overthrowing the government-established quarantine zone. Several officials were still at large, and among them, Henry had a radio, so it was essential to capture him as soon as possible. All the rebels began searching house by house. Hiding in a civilian house, Joel was worried that they needed to leave the area before nightfall. It was only then that Joel had time to apologize for his negligence earlier, which had led to Ellie participating in the violent scene. To his surprise, the young girl didn't seem to care, saying it wasn't her first time experiencing such things. Joel was somewhat relieved and returned the handgun to Ellie, teaching her how to hold it more steadily. This was not the basic firearms knowledge taught in the quarantine zone schools, which shows that Joel had fully recognized Ellie and no longer considered her a burden or cargo. Meanwhile, after half a day of searching, the rebels finally made a new discovery. In an attic, they found many children's drawings and some empty bottles and cans on the ground. Catherine was convinced that these were left by her old rival, Henry. She thought that perhaps due to the depletion of food, he had taken the children elsewhere. Suddenly, there was a noise from a room downstairs. Upon entering to investigate, they noticed an obvious depression in the middle of the floor. Catherine cursed and quickly left the room, knowing that something terrible was hidden underground. She ordered her men to seal off the building and decided to prioritize finding the troublemakers for now. At this point, Joel and Ellie had arrived at an abandoned 42-story building. Joel decided to climb as high as possible, believing that the higher they went, the safer they would be. At daybreak, it would also be easier to observe escape routes. Ellie was puzzled about how Joel had seen through the disguise of the injured man, who had asked for help earlier. Joel admitted that he hadn't discovered anything, but he had done similar things in the past to obtain survival supplies. To survive, one shouldn't trust anyone. After climbing to around the 40th floor, Joel picked a random room to rest in. He carefully scattered broken glass at the doorway to prevent anyone from sneaking in. Joel felt somewhat guilty, thinking that Ellie was too young to be exposed to the cruelty of the world so early. After some time, Joel was awakened by Ellie's urgent cries, only to be greeted by 2 gun barrels. The rebels in Kansas City finally overthrew the brutal rule of the authorities. All residents gathered in the square, cheering non-stop. Next was the bloody purge of the remaining forces, and of course, the traitors among them. These people were originally lower-class citizens of the city, but to obtain more living supplies, they secretly leaked confidential information to the former rulers. The rebel leader, Catherine, was disgusted and ordered her deputy to execute them all. She then emphasized the importance of capturing the Henry brothers. At this time, on the city streets, squads of rebels were searching everywhere. The Henry brothers, relying on their familiarity with the terrain, repeatedly evaded the rebels' sight. After a few detours, they quietly enter an abandoned house, only to encounter a figure emerging from the darkness. Henry was relieved to recognize the figure as an old friend. They had agreed to take refuge in this hidden attic during the city's unrest. However, they didn't have much food. Henry calculated that they could last at most 11 days. As the rebels continued to search the streets for them, Henry saw his younger brother, Sam, sulking in a corner. He then magically pulled out a bag of colored markers. Cartoon images soon appeared on the walls, quickly making Sam forget their current predicament. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed, and their food reserves were depleted. An old man who had gone out to search for supplies hadn't returned for many days. Henry understood that he had probably been captured by the rebels, and to protect the hiding place of the brothers, the old man might have lost his life. The rebels were still searching outside, and Henry knew it was time to leave. However, Sam was nervous. Henry glanced at the Superman painting on the wall and pretended to be mysterious, asking his brother to close his eyes. He then painted Sam's face with color, making him look like the little Superman on the wall. Sam immediately relaxed with a smile. Just as the brothers were preparing to leave, they heard the sound of gunfire outside. Henry peeked out and saw Joel fighting with the city's rebels. A thought crossed his mind, and he followed Joel from a distance to a building. Taking advantage of the night, he sneaked into the room and captured Joel and Ellie, which explains why Joel was awakened by Ellie's cries and greeted by 2 gun barrels earlier. However, Henry did not plan to kill them and steal their supplies. Instead, he wanted to propose cooperation. All 4 of them were targets of the rebels. In a sense, they were natural allies, and more importantly, Henry knew a secret route out of the city. Joel asked why Henry needed his cooperation if he could escape on his own. Henry explained that he had never killed anyone in his life and needed a skilled fighter like Joel to help clear the way. Seeing that Ellie and Sam were already getting along, Joel finally agreed to cooperate. Henry hurriedly pulled out a piece of white paper. The surroundings of Kansas City were guarded by rebels, and the only way to escape the city was through the underground tunnels. Joel was curious. If they wouldn't encounter rebel guards, what enemies would they need to face? Henry explained that the city was free of the infected because they had all been driven underground. Joel questioned if going through the underground tunnels wasn't a death wish. Henry assured him that there were very few infected in the tunnels, and they might encounter only 1 or 2 at most. Joel knew that although it was somewhat risky, it was their only means of escape at the moment. The group of 4 hurried to the subway station, planning to escape the city through the underground tunnels. The path ahead was pitch dark, and they walked cautiously, wary of the infected that could appear at any moment. Fortunately, it didn't take long for them to find a hidden chamber with walls covered in colorful patterns and various supplies scattered on the ground. Joel was not surprised. When the fungal outbreak first occurred, many survivors sought refuge underground, but ultimately they vanished. Ellie and Sam, however, didn't concern themselves with that and were busy exploring interesting toys. Having grown up in the post-apocalyptic world, they couldn't comprehend the cruelty of the fungal outbreak. Henry felt glad as he hadn't seen his brother this happy in a long time. Joel suddenly understood why Henry chose to be a traitor. To support his brother in this harsh world, he needed more resources. However, Henry sighed and explained that it wasn't that simple. Otherwise, the rebels wouldn't be searching for them so fervently. As it turned out, Sam had leukemia, and the only way to save him was to trade with the rulers for medicine. So Henry had no choice but to betray and cause the death of the former rebel leader, Marlene. The current rebel leader, Catherine, was the sister of Marlene, which explained her deep hatred for the 2 brothers. After hearing this, Joel remained silent for a long time, but he didn't blame Henry. In the post-apocalyptic world, few people could claim to have a clear conscience. Fortunately, the 4 of them managed to cross the tunnel and arrived outside the city. The innocent Ellie had already begun to persuade Henry and his brother to go with them to Wyoming, but Joel disagreed with that. Ellie seemed to have anticipated his reaction. A gunshot broke the silence, and Joel and the others quickly took cover behind a car. From a loft not far away, someone was sniping. Joel knew that they couldn't continue like this, so he told Ellie to stay put while he circled around to deal with the enemy. Joel moved from cover to cover, timing his moves with the rhythm of the gunshots. Thankfully, the sniper's aim wasn't accurate, and Joel got closer to the loft. After quietly opening the door and suppressing his footsteps, he finally reached the 2nd floor. Surprisingly, the sniper turned out to be an elder. Joel gestured that he could live if he put down his weapon, but in the next moment, the elder was shot in the head. Joel picked up the sniper rifle and prepared to leave when Catherine's voice came through the radio, saying that reinforcements were on their way. Joel shouted for the others to run, but it was too late. A large group of rebels had already arrived, led by a heavy-duty truck that drove straight towards Ellie and the others. Fortunately, Joel managed to shoot the driver just in time, causing it to crash into a nearby house. A loud explosion followed, startling the rebels who had just gotten out of their vehicles. As the dust settled, Catherine began leading her troops in a search. Joel hid behind a wall in the loft, knowing that fighting back would be futile. Henry was hiding behind the car and realized that they would eventually be discovered. In order to save Ellie and Sam, he stepped out and asked Catherine to spare the children. However, she refused, stating that children die in the apocalypse too. Just as she was about to shoot Henry, the truck that had just exploded suddenly sank into the ground, revealing a deep pit beneath the loft's ruins. Low growls echoed from within, and in the next moment, a horde of mutated infected emerged from the pit, fearlessly attacking the nearby rebels. Despite their firepower, the rebels couldn't withstand the infected's onslaught. Henry quickly regrouped with the 2 children and led them towards safety. Unfortunately, they were soon separated by the infected. Joel provided covering fire in the loft, and Ellie quickly crawled to an abandoned car for cover. At that moment, a massive infected emerged from the pit to flex its monstrous figure. Catherine's man urged her to leave and then opened fire on the giant infected, only to be brutally killed in the next moment. A small infected crawled into the car where Ellie was hiding, and the frightened girl fled. She spotted the trapped Henry and his brother and ran towards them without hesitation, while Joel fired shot after shot to cover them. Ellie quickly pulled out her knife, killing 2 infected with swift movements, and the 3 of them finally managed to escape the battlefield. To their surprise, Catherine suddenly appeared with a gun, and Ellie's face turned pale. Just then, the small infected creature appeared again and pounced on Catherine. Joel quickly led the others away, leaving the numerous infected to run towards the residential area. In an abandoned building far from the city, Joel, still shaken, panted heavily. However, Ellie and Sam seemed unfazed and were engrossed in some books. Henry urged the children to go to sleep, but Ellie called Sam to continue reading after the door was closed. The boy looked somewhat disheartened, and he wrote a line in his notebook, asking her what she was most afraid of. Ellie said she feared being the last person left in the world. Sam feared whether he would still be himself after being infected. He then rolled up his pants to reveal a bleeding bite mark. Ellie was shocked by that. She had been bitten by an infected before and thought her blood might be the antidote. So Ellie cut her palm with a knife and smeared her blood on Sam's wound. The boy was still worried and asked Ellie to stay awake with him. Ellie readily agreed, but she accidentally fell asleep until morning. She then saw Sam sitting silently by the bed and wanted to greet him, but he suddenly lunged at her. Henry, outside the room, was also startled and picked up a gun, shooting the now zombified Sam. As his brother's blood slowly oozed out, Henry realized that he had killed his own brother, and he pointed the gun at his own head, sending himself to meet Jesus. Afterward, Joel buried the Henry brothers in a patch of green grass. Ellie placed Sam's used notebook on the mound of earth. The words "sorry" were written on it because she hadn't stayed awake like Sam as promised. Joel didn't offer any comfort to her because everyone had to experience too much regret and apology in the zombie apocalypse. The Last of Us, Season 1, Episodes 6 to 9. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The latter part of the series begins with a rewind of the unknown fungus sweeping the globe, causing an apocalypse on planet Earth. When autumn and winter arrive, Joel and Ellie have reached Wyoming, hoping to find a cure to the fungus through Joel's brother Tommy. However, the area is vast and sparsely populated, making it difficult to find anyone, let alone his brother. After wandering for a while, they finally find a small, isolated cabin inhabited by an elderly couple, who are surprisingly calm in the 2 unexpected visitors. Upon seeing the quirky Ellie, the couple's last bit of wariness vanishes. Being familiar with the local terrain, the old couple warns Joel not to cross the deadly river in the middle of the forest because the opposite bank is densely populated and might harbor numerous infected and marauders. However, Joel is determined to check the other side of the river. After thanking the elderly couple, Joel and Ellie set off again. They traverse snowy landscapes and wild grass, eventually reaching a green river. They decide to rest by the riverbank for the night, as the sparsely populated area is virtually free of the infected. Joel lights a bonfire, and the night sky reflects the stunning aurora. Ellie thoroughly enjoys her current life. Born in a quarantine zone, she can only learn about the outside world through books. Now, as they approach their destination, she is already considering how to enjoy her life once a cure is developed, while Joel hopes to find a secluded place with his brother, build a small cabin, and raise some livestock. As night falls, Joel tells Ellie to sleep while he keeps watch. However, the next morning, Joel wakes from his dream, only to find Ellie standing beside him, holding a gun. Joel scolds Ellie for not waking him up. The girl on night watch doesn't argue, and obediently nods her head. As they continue their journey, they soon encounter an iron bridge spanning the long river. Joel fires a few shots to test the safety of the area, and after waiting for a while without any response, he concludes that the opposite side is safe. They manage to cross the river, and Ellie can't help but mutter that it doesn't seem as dangerous as the old couple in the cabin had claimed. They follow the river and spot a dam in the distance. Joel tells Ellie that before the apocalypse, it used to be a large power station. Just then, a few strangers on horseback emerged from the hillside. Joel had no time to react before they surrounded him. The group were hostile, and they unleashed a hunting dog to check if Joel was infected. Joel tried to act calm. Although Ellie was immune, there was no guarantee that she did not carry the virus. As the hunting dog drew closer to Ellie, Joel panicked, but there was nothing he could do. Fortunately, the dog didn't detect anything unusual. Joel then explained that he was looking for someone named Tommy. The scene then fast-forwards to Joel and the others galloping on horseback across the plains, soon arriving at a human community. After passing through the protective barriers, the view changed entirely. It was hard to believe that this was a post-apocalyptic survivor camp. Compared to the desolation and chaos outside, this place was like paradise. Everyone's faces were filled with happy smiles. Joel looked around and spotted his brother Tommy, who was working on a house in the distance. The two brothers, separated for half a year, were finally reunited here. Joel couldn't help but tear up at the sight of his only remaining family member. The group soon arrived at a large restaurant where Joel and Ellie began to devour their food. It had been a long time since they had a decent meal. Tommy was overjoyed and formally introduced his wife to them. The woman recognized Joel earlier outside the town because Tommy often mentioned him. She had spent 7 years building up the community to its current state of popularity and prosperity. The camp had destroyed all radios early on, avoiding the attention of any forces. The community had already restored electricity 2 years ago, drawing power from the hydroelectric plant that Joel had seen earlier. Livestock breeding was also on track, making the place self-sufficient. Resources were distributed by a committee. After learning about the community, Joel decided to talk privately with his brother. He wasn't there to retire and enjoy life. His main priority was still to deliver Ellie to the Fireflies' headquarters. However, Tommy began to hesitate. He knew Joel wanted to take him away, but he had already adapted to his current life and didn't want to live a dangerous life with his brother. Joel persisted in trying to persuade him, but Tommy revealed that he was about to become a father. He was looking forward to his future life. Joel felt sad and said he would leave early the next morning. Amidst the bustling crowd, he saw a familiar figure, but quickly realized that his daughter had already passed away. Now, his only remaining brother might also be leaving him behind. At this time, Ellie was already in Tommy's home, having taken a warm bath. The room still contained many old items, and there were several clean clothes folded in the bedroom. Tommy's wife had prepared them specifically for Ellie. The young girl curiously picked up a transparent lid and only learned its purpose after reading the instructions. In the living room, a small blackboard on the fireplace displayed the names of 2 deceased children. After asking Tommy's wife, Ellie found out that one of them, a girl named Sarah, was actually Joel's daughter. After getting dressed up, the woman took Ellie to a movie theater, a luxurious activity in a post-apocalyptic world. However, Ellie didn't focus on the movie and kept looking around. Meanwhile, Joel was feeling down in the storeroom. Tommy brought him a brand new pair of boots, feeling somewhat guilty for his brother. Joel didn't continue the conversation, but instead brought up Ellie's background. The antibodies in the girl's body might save the world, so she had to be delivered to the Fireflies' headquarters. This was also his wife's dying wish. Joel initially thought he could complete the task smoothly, but after experiencing many events on the way, he realized he was no longer as strong as before. Sometimes he even needed Ellie's help to deal with enemies. Continuing like this, he might one day endanger Ellie. The best solution was for the younger and stronger Tommy to continue escorting Ellie. After hearing this, Tommy remained silent for a long time before agreeing to leave with her early the next morning. After saying goodbye to Tommy, Joel went to the room where Ellie was staying and saw that her face was full of sadness. It turned out that she had left the movie halfway to look for Joel and had overheard the brothers' conversation. Ellie had been an orphan since she was little and had always regarded Joel as her only family. Now he was leaving her behind, and the young girl was filled with anger. Joel looked into her eyes and then turned around and left. Returning to his room, Joel lay on his bed. The image of his daughter appeared in his mind again. Early the next morning, Tommy and Ellie packed their gear and went to the stable, only to find that Joel had been ready for some time. It turns out he decided to take Ellie with him after all. Ellie, as if expecting this, quickly jumped onto the Ferrari horse. Tommy handed his sniper rifle to his brother and reminded him to return here alive after completing the mission. Joel and Ellie left the community, and after this experience, he began to teach the young girl some survival skills. In the post-apocalypse, it was better to rely on oneself than others. Ellie learned quickly, especially in some areas where she seemed to be a natural. They rode their horses for several days, crossing jungles and plains, eventually reaching the edge of the city. The Fireflies' headquarters they were looking for was located in a university town in the city center. Upon arriving at their destination, Ellie began to imagine the college life there, and Joel explained it to her. A group of monkeys suddenly appeared in their sight, and Ellie guessed they had escaped from a lab, indicating that the biology lab of the Fireflies wasn't far. However, when they arrived, there were no guards at the entrance. Joel gradually felt a sense of unease, and as expected, the hall was filled with scattered debris, but no people were in sight. A relocation list on a table indicated that the fireflies had moved elsewhere. Suddenly, there was noise from upstairs. Joel slowly approached, and after cautioning Ellie, he forcefully opened the door, revealing a monkey. Joel sighed in relief. On a large map hanging on the wall, all arrows converged on one point, indicating that the fireflies had moved to a sheltered city. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the window, and they saw several looters appear. Joel took Ellie downstairs, intending to sneak away. However, just as they were about to mount their Ferrari horses, a looter suddenly appeared. Joel dodged and grabbed the attacker's neck, taking him down, but not before being stabbed in the abdomen. As he pulled out the knife, several more looters appeared. The two quickly got on their horses and fled into the distance. Ellie fired her gun, eventually shaking off the pursuers. But Joel, having lost too much blood, lost consciousness and fell from the horse. Ellie checked on him, but there was no response. She was in despair because Joel had always taken care of everything for her, and she had never even worried about where to go. Ellie struggled to drag him into a nearby cabin, but left behind an obvious trail. Enduring the pain, Joel scolded Ellie and urged her to leave. Seeing that she did not budge, he pushed her away. After taking a look at Joel, she turned and walked towards the door. The moment she touched the doorknob, a long-forgotten memory came to her mind. Half a year ago, Ellie was a trainee in the quarantine zone, along with many other young orphans. Suddenly, a big girl stole Ellie's headphones. Ellie immediately threw a punch. As a result, Ellie was hit in her eye, and the big girl got multiple stitches on her face. The instructor in charge was quite exasperated. Ellie had already been put in solitary confinement 3 times that month. Those with poor performance would become low-ranking soldiers, doing patrol work daily, and might be killed by the fireflies one day. Only those who followed the rules could become officers, living a comfortable life, and even being able to discipline people like the big girl. Without hesitation, Ellie chose to obey the rule. The instructor did not punish her this time, and even returned the confiscated tape recorder to her. After this incident, Ellie decided to be a rule-abiding good girl, and turned off the lights on time for bedtime. In the middle of the night, a figure stealthily climbed in through the window. The alert Ellie pushed the intruder to the ground and looked closely. It was her friend Riley, who had been missing for a month. Ellie was full of resentment because her friend disappeared without leaving a word. Riley didn't respond, and after silence, she said that she had joined the Fireflies. Ellie was furious, as they had been taught since childhood that the Fireflies were the root cause of the unrest. Riley did not argue, but stated that she wanted to show Ellie the most wonderful night of her life. The quarantine zone had always been under a curfew. The 2 young girls evaded the guards and walked towards the darkness in the distance. After arriving at an abandoned mansion, they climbed over the wall together. Ellie, full of curiosity, asked where Riley was taking her, but Riley just refused to answer, insisting that keeping it a mystery would lead to a surprise. In the blink of an eye, the 2 arrived at a hallway, with a corpse lying on the floor ahead. Ellie walked straight over to examine it, guessing that the person might have died from taking pills while drinking alcohol. She remained calm and even picked up the unfinished alcohol from the deceased. Suddenly, a loud noise rang out, and the body fell through the rotten pipe into the lower level. The 2 were startled and drank some alcohol to calm themselves down. Ellie had always harbored some hostility towards the Fireflies. The armed conflicts within the quarantine zone had all been initiated by them. Riley became somewhat silent. A month ago, while strolling outside at night, she had inadvertently encountered Marlene, the rebel leader of the Fireflies. The ideas Marlene shared resonated deeply with her, but Riley didn't reveal it yet. After that, the 2 girls climbed over several rooftops and finally arrived at a huge building. Ellie was surprised, believing that this is the mall that had been designated a forbidden zone by the relief agency. Riley nodded with a smile and then led Ellie through a broken hole into the mall. The curious Ellie found it just an ordinary power distribution room. Riley said that the surprise was about to come and let Ellie go through the door at the end of the hallway by herself. Ellie quickly crossed the room and arrived at the corridor. Accompanied by the roar of the generator, a colorful post-apocalyptic mall appeared before her. Ellie was stunned, having never seen such a beautiful sight in her life. The 2 soon arrived at an elevator, Ellie's first encounter with such a device. She was playing happily in the elevator when Riley forcibly pulled her down, urging her not to waste too much time there. The surrounding streets were full of shops. Although the merchandise inside had been looted, Ellie could imagine how prosperous the place must have been before the apocalypse. Riley suddenly stopped and mysteriously asked Ellie to close her eyes. Ellie was overjoyed, allowing Riley to lead her to a carousel. Ellie was both curious and delighted about something she had only seen in books, and even took out some wine to celebrate. Riley then began to explain to her. Under the rule of the relief agency, civilians in the quarantine zone had to perform tedious work every day in exchange for limited survival supplies. The purpose of the Fireflies organization was to overthrow the rule of the relief agency and return the residents to the life they had before the apocalypse. However, Ellie still found it hard to accept. She believed that once she grew up and became a manager, she could change everything. Riley just shook her head. It turns out that Riley had just turned 17 last month, but the task assigned to her was to guard the sewers. She did not want to spend her life watching others shovel feces, so she chose to escape and join the Fireflies' rebel force. Ellie became somewhat silent, realizing that things were more complicated than she expected. The two then visited every corner of the mall, experiencing the once popular photo booth. Although the printed photos weren't great, they still enjoyed it. When they arrived at an arcade, Ellie was utterly amazed. The various game machines left her dazzled. As the two girls were having the time of their lives, they were unaware that in a dark corner at the end of the corridor, a sleeping infected suddenly woke up. Riley excitedly announced that it was time to move on to the next stop. To her surprise, Ellie said she should return to the training camp, as she didn't want to miss her morning class in her pursuit to become manager. Riley didn't try to stop her, but had prepared a gift for her. Ellie lit up and followed Riley to a bakery where Riley lived. Riley took a worn-out book from her bag, which had Ellie's favorite collection of puns. Just then, Ellie noticed a row of grenades on a shelf. Riley explained that she would never use them on civilians. Ellie responded sharply, asking if a new recruit like her could make that decision, then angrily turned and left. Riley then revealed that she would be sent to the Atlanta quarantine zone, and that tonight was her last night here. Ellie felt sad, unable to understand why her best friend would abandon her. She then angrily stormed off. As soon as she stepped out of the corridor, Ellie regained her composure. She realized she shouldn't say goodbye to her best friend like this, and turned back to the mall. Suddenly, she heard a scream not far away. Worried that her friend was in danger, she approached the source of the noise. She discovered it was just a talking doll, the last surprise Riley had prepared for her. Riley finally revealed the reason for her departure. Having lost her parents at a young age, she had joined the Fireflies organization, and despite her short time there, she felt a sense of belonging like a family, which made it impossible for her to refuse any decision made by the organization. Ellie didn't try to persuade her to stay any longer. All she could offer now was her blessings. Riley decided to have one last celebration. With joyful music playing, the two girls put on funny headgear and danced their hormones away on the counter. As the music faded, Ellie looked at Riley, asking her once again to stay. Just as Riley was about to nod in agreement, they heard a commotion outside. Both girls sensed danger, and an infected person burst out, roaring like a goose. Riley fired her gun, but failed to land a deadly blow. She could only grab Ellie and run for their lives. The infected person quickly caught up with them. Ellie pulled out her dagger and stabbed the infected person repeatedly. Just as it was about to bite, Riley hit it with a club, entangling it. Ellie seized the opportunity and drove her dagger deep into the infected person's head. Upon her first successful kill of an infected person, Ellie was excited. However, she noticed that something was off. Her arm had been bitten by the infected person, and Riley's hand had a deep scratch as well. They now realized that they had to either end their lives before the infection took hold, or continue fighting despite the odds. Riley chose the latter without hesitation, believing that even if there were only several minutes left in her life, she would keep fighting. Back to the present time, after recalling everything, Ellie realized that she couldn't abandon her companions any longer. She might have been powerless to help Riley before, but now she had to do everything in her power to help Joel. She quickly found a thread in a drawer and began to stitch up his wounds. Although Joel's wounds were stitched up, he showed obvious signs of infection. Ellie stayed by his side, but this was not a long-term solution, especially since their food supply was running low. She mashed up the last of their dried meat and placed it in Joel's mouth, then took her gun and left the cabin. She looked around and didn't see any pursuers. Ellie walked towards the depths of the forest, knowing that she had to hunt for food as soon as possible. However, the cold weather, along with Ellie's insufficient survival skills, made it difficult. It wasn't until close to noon that she found a lucky deer. After choosing a good sniping position and recalling Joel's teachings, she pulled the trigger. The deer was hit, but it didn't die instantly. However, two strangers appeared and took the deer. Ellie yelled and appeared with her gun not far away. Caught off guard, the two men dropped their rifles and raised their hands in surrender. One of them claimed to be a preacher and seemed calm. He knew Ellie couldn't carry the deer by herself and offered to exchange supplies. Ellie asked if they had any medication to treat infections. The preacher nodded, saying that his town, Silver Lake, had some antibiotics. So Ellie agreed to trade half of the deer meat for the medication. The preacher then called his companion to fetch the medicine and dragged the deer back to the abandoned cabin. Ellie and the preacher sat down by the fire, engaging in a casual conversation. The preacher thought it was dangerous for Ellie to be out there alone and invited her to join him in Silver Lake, a self-sufficient resort created by survivors. According to him, this winter had been particularly long, crops couldn't grow, and wild game was scarce. A few days ago, a man in Silver Lake was killed and his daughter wanted a proper burial for her father. But the preacher refused the girl's request, explaining that the ground was too hard and that they would have to wait until spring to bury him. To help everyone through the winter, the preacher and his deputy went hunting in the forest, where they unexpectedly met Ellie. The preacher mentioned that he used to be a teacher before becoming a preacher. Upon hearing this, Ellie relaxed her guard, finding humor in the homophonic pun between teacher and preacher. However, the preacher became serious as he mentioned that the man who had been killed a few days ago was killed by a man accompanied by a young girl. Just then, the preacher's fellow suddenly appeared at the door with a gun. Fortunately, the preacher didn't intend to harm Ellie and instructed his fellow to throw out the antibiotics they had retrieved. Ellie didn't dare bring up the deer meat and grabbed the antibiotics before rushing back to Joel. Seeing Joel's festering wound, Ellie was once again uncertain about where to inject the antibiotics. Hesitating for a moment, she stabbed the needle near the wound. With everything done, all that was left was to pray and wait. In Silver Lake Town, located at the edge of the forest, the streets were filled with desolation. As two people worried about their dwindling food supply, a man walked in with fresh meat. Once the meat was prepared, all the survivors gathered in the dining hall. Suddenly, the door was pushed open, and the preacher returned with the deer. Everyone fell silent, wondering what kind of meat they had in their bowls. The preacher changed the subject, saying that he had found the man and girl responsible for injuring their people. He planned to gather a search party the next day to find their whereabouts. The deceased man's daughter rebuked the preacher for not seeking immediate revenge, but he responded with a slap and a friendly smile, telling her to show respect because he is her father now. Everyone remained silent until the preacher finished his prayer, and then they began to eat the meat in their bowls. The next day arrived. Ellie checked Joel's wound, which had improved significantly since the day before. She gave him another injection, opened the cabin door, and let the warm sunlight in. However, she had no time to enjoy the warmth as she started to shovel snow, needing to tend to their old horse. Suddenly, she noticed birds being startled in the distance and sensed something was wrong. She stealthily approached in the direction of the birds and saw several figures approaching, led by the preacher. It turned out they hadn't let Ellie go out of kindness, but intended to follow her trail to find the injured Joel. Still, the preacher instructed his men to capture Ellie alive if possible. Ellie panicked. She called out to Joel, but he remained unconscious. She left her dagger with him, instructing him to kill anyone who came close. She then quickly ran out of the basement, moved the wooden cabinet to block the entrance, and rode the horse toward the preacher and his men. Her goal was to lead these unwelcome visitors away, giving Joel the best chance of survival. However, these men were no pushovers. They shot the horse, and the impact knocked Ellie unconscious. As the men approached to finish her off, the preacher fired a warning shot, insisting on taking the girl back to the town. He ordered 2 men to drag the horse away, and the remaining 3 to kill Joel. One of the men was lucky enough to find where Joel was hiding. He noticed signs of habitation and began to quietly move the wooden cabinet blocking the basement entrance. Although he tried to keep the noise to a minimum, he still woke up Joel from his unconscious state. As the man approached the blood-stained bed, Joel suddenly lunged forward and stabbed him in the neck. It wasn't until the man stopped moving that Joel released his grip on the man's neck. Soon after, the men searching for Joel realized that one of their companions had gone missing. As they looked for him, they fell into a trap Joel had set, and the remaining 2 were captured. After a brutal interrogation, Joel learned the location of Silver Lake Town. He was burning with rage because their people had targeted Ellie while he was unconscious, and he believed they all deserved to die. Meanwhile, Ellie had regained consciousness and found herself locked in an iron cage. The preacher believed that Ellie, on her own, would struggle to survive in this post-apocalyptic world. He suggested she join the town and start a new life. Ellie remained silent and ignored him. When the preacher left, she began looking for a way to escape. To her shock, she saw a human ear in the corner, and the preacher noticed her panic. Following her gaze, he saw the ear as well. Ellie immediately thought of something and looked at the chunks of meat on her plate, accusing the preacher of wanting to chop her up. But the preacher explained that she had merely knocked over a plate of deer meat. As for the other townspeople resorting to cannibalism to fill their stomachs, he saw it as a desperate choice. As the town's guardian, he couldn't just watch everyone starve to death. Joel had killed others to protect Ellie, and in that sense, the two were similar. Ellie seemed to gain some insight, and her emotions settled a bit. Seizing the opportunity, the preacher told her that from their first encounter, he had seen her as a natural-born leader, decisive and courageous. He knew that he would grow old one day, and the people of the town needed someone like Ellie to protect them. Ellie fell silent once more, then suddenly mentioned the injured Joel, asking if the preacher could spare him. The preacher praised her sense of responsibility, a necessary trait for a leader, and promised that if she joined them, he would agree to any conditions. Ellie seemed to be convinced and slowly extended her hands. However, she grabbed the preacher's fingers, attempting to snatch the keys from him. Unfortunately, she was pushed back by a heavy punch. The preacher, now out of patience after being fooled, left her with a cold remark, "Prepare to become dinner," before walking away. Meanwhile, Joel had already made his way into Silver Lake. Following the bloodstains left in the snow, he arrived at a remote warehouse. The place was filled with various useless items, including Ellie's backpack. It seemed that the townspeople had captured many survivors. As he investigated further, Joel found the corpse of a horse, and shockingly, several frozen human bodies hanging from the building roof. On the other side, Ellie had been dragged out of her cage. She seemed to anticipate her fate and, seizing a chance, bit the preacher. However, this did nothing to prevent her from being restrained on a large chopping block. Desperate, Ellie yelled out that she was infected, and that the preacher was too, after being bitten by her. She then revealed the wound on her arm. The two men were taken aback, and Ellie grabbed a knife and knocked one of them down, before quickly escaping the room. Unfortunately, the door was locked, so she grabbed a burning stick and threw it at the approaching preacher, accidentally setting the curtains on fire. The preacher didn't bother with the growing blaze, but instead searched for Ellie, curious about the wound on her arm. Ellie picked up a dagger and lunged at the preacher from behind. Although she was thrown off, she didn't give up. She grabbed another dagger nearby and furiously stabbed at the preacher. As she pushed open the door to the dining hall, she happened to run into Joel, who had just arrived. The little girl finally felt a sense of relief. After surviving the crisis in the town, Joel and Ellie resumed their journey to find the Fireflies' headquarters. As they drew closer to their destination, Ellie became quiet, no longer her usual self. Joel seemed to sense something and began to strike conversations. He knew that the day they met the Fireflies might also be the day they would part ways. However, they both avoided discussing this topic, simply continuing their search for the Fireflies' headquarters. The pair soon enter an abandoned building and decided to go to the rooftop to survey the surrounding landscape. Joel hoisted Ellie onto the second floor, but as soon as she let down the ladder, she disappeared. Concerned, Joel quickly climbed the ladder to find Ellie, who seemed to have discovered something fascinating and was running around excitedly. When he finally caught up with her, they encountered a giraffe nibbling on tree leaves. Ellie stood still and watched. Joel smiled, picked some leaves, and handed them to her. After the giraffe had its fill and left, Ellie reluctantly went to the rooftop, where she saw several more giraffes standing in the meadow, like an isolated paradise. Seeing Ellie carefree, Joel was moved and suddenly suggested they not look for the Fireflies anymore, as their current life wasn't so bad. However, Ellie seemed to have grown a lot and felt that they should see things through to the end. They had experienced so much on their journey, and they couldn't give up halfway. The two fell silent again and started heading towards the lab's location. After passing through a tunnel, they came across rows of medical tents. Joel recognized it as an emergency medical camp established by the military at the beginning of the apocalypse. Joel pointed to the wound on his forehead, recalling that he had been placed in a medical camp the day after he lost his daughter, Sarah. Back then, he couldn't see any reason to live. So many years had passed, and now Joel could mention his daughter's name without any emotion. Ellie couldn't help but marvel at how time could heal everything. Joel, however, said it wasn't time that healed the wounds. Ellie nodded, understanding that she was the medicine Joel was referring to. She then pulled out the book of puns and began to joke around, lightening the mood. As the two were laughing and talking, a grenade suddenly flew towards them. They quickly lost consciousness in the explosion. When Joel woke up, he saw Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, standing before him. It turned out that Marlene was still alive after the previous attack and had survived her injury. Marlene was full of admiration, as she had traveled from the Boston quarantine zone to this location, losing more than half of her soldiers along the way, while Joel had managed to bring Ellie here single-handedly. Joel was only concerned about Ellie's safety. Marlene informed him that Ellie was being prepared for surgery. The organization's doctors believed that the fungus inside Ellie was secreting a chemical signal that made the bacteria mistake her for one of their own, which was the reason for Ellie's immunity. Joel was puzzled as to why the fungus inside other infected individuals did not secrete the same chemical signal. Marlene hesitated before revealing that the fungus inside Ellie had been growing with her since birth. She then began to tell a story from more than a decade ago. A young pregnant woman was frantically running through the woods, as if being chased by a terrifying presence. Stumbling along the way, she eventually found refuge in an abandoned house. Unable to endure any longer, she found a hidden room and began to wail in pain. Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the door outside. Just as she pulled out a knife, an infected individual broke in. Unable to move, she could only wait for the attacker to approach, before stabbing it with the knife. As she let out a sigh of relief, the sound of her baby's cries filled the air, and that baby is Ellie. However, the mother's leg had been bitten by the infected. That night, Marlene followed her trail and found the house, but the mother was already on the verge of turning. She entrusted Ellie to Marlene's care and lied that she had been bitten only after giving birth. Marlene couldn't refuse her dying friend's last wish and promised to ensure Ellie's safety. After carrying the baby outside, Marlene returned to the house and pulled the trigger on her friend. Ellie, who had been infected with the fungus in her mother's womb, had since possessed a unique immunity. Marlene told Joel that the Fireflies' doctors were preparing to extract the fungus from Ellie's body and cultivate it in a lab. They hoped to soon develop a cure for the fungal infection. Joel realized that they were going to cut open Ellie's head for research, as he knew the fungus grew inside the brain. Marlene had to be frank to him that in order to save humanity, they had no choice but to sacrifice Ellie. She felt immense guilt because she had promised Ellie's mother to protect her. Enraged, Joel cursed loudly, but he was knocked out by a guard. Marlene had no intention of harming him and ordered her men to take Joel to a distant roadside. Under the escort of 2 guards, he quickly learned the location of the operating room. Seizing the opportunity, Joel grabbed the guard's weapon and shot both of them down. With his backpack on, he headed upstairs. He was determined to eliminate all the guards and rescue Ellie, who was in mortal danger. He showed no mercy to anyone standing in his way. When he ran out of bullets, he seized weapons from the fallen foes. With his shooting skills, he left a trail of bodies in his wake. He opened the door to the operating room. Thankfully, Ellie's surgery had not yet begun. Without wasting time, Joel shot the lead surgeon and quickly carried an unconscious Ellie away. As he reached the basement and prepared to drive off, Marlene appeared with a gun. She accused Joel of being selfish, asking how long Ellie would last in the post-apocalyptic world after his death. Furious, Joel retorted that it wasn't her decision to make. Marlene countered, saying that he should let Ellie decide what she wants. Joel fell silent, deep in thought, but as Marlene slowly approached, he pulled the trigger. He had made his choice. Between the world and Ellie, he chose the latter. The scene changes, and a groggy Ellie wakes up in the backseat of the car. Joel explains that the research at the Fireflies' headquarters had failed, and they couldn't find a way to create a cure. After the lab was attacked by bandits, he barely managed to save Ellie. Now, with everything behind them, Joel plans to take Ellie back to his brother's quarantine zone. As their car runs out of gas, they find themselves not far from their destination, just beyond the mountain ahead. Perhaps to cover up his guilt for lying, Joel becomes quite talkative, even bringing up his daughter Sarah. However, Ellie seems to be preoccupied and stops in her tracks, looking at Joel. She recalls her deceased friend Riley, as well as Tess and Sam, who all perished due to the infection. All she wants to know now is whether what Joel had said about the Fireflies lab was true. Joel steadies himself and confirms it. As for Joel's final decision, it's understandable why he made that choice. The world did not become what it is because of Ellie, and not everyone wants to be a savior. As long as the ones they care about are safe and alive, the world is of little concern. When Ellie finally asks Joel if he lied, she must have sensed something. Deep down, she might have been willing to sacrifice herself to save the world. Otherwise, she wouldn't have mentioned her friends who died from the infection. But when Joel confirms his story, she chooses to believe him. This sets the stage for the two characters' separation in the second season. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.